It began as an idea so audacious that even Britain's own engineers thought it was madness. In the spring of 1942, as Europe burned and Nazi Germany's iron grip stretched from the Pyrenees to the Arctic Circle, Winston Churchill sat at his desk with a single, impossible question. How do we invade a continent without a port? To the untrained eye, the question made little sense. Every invasion in recorded history had depended on one thing: harbor access. Armies needed docks to unload troops, tanks, food, and ammunition. Without them, no force could sustain itself on foreign soil. And yet, that's exactly what the Allies faced in planning the liberation of France. When British and American strategists met to plan Operation Overlord, they knew the Germans expected an invasion somewhere along the French coast. The Atlantic Wall stretched for 2,400 miles, an unbroken chain of bunkers, artillery, and minefields. Every deep-water port, from Cherbourg to Calais, was fortified with deadly precision. The Dieppe raid of 1942 had already proven what a frontal assault on a port would cost. In just 9 hours, nearly 60% of the Allied landing force was killed, wounded, or captured. The Germans had slaughtered the raiders before they could even unload a single tank. That disaster left an unmistakable message. If the Allies were going to invade Europe, it could not be through an existing port. But without ports, how could they supply an army of millions? That's when Churchill scribbled a line that would change military engineering forever. They must have floating piers. At first, his advisors laughed. Floating harbors? Massive concrete docks, built in England and floated across the channel? It sounded like a fantasy, a sketch from a science fiction novel. Yet Churchill wasn't joking. Let's build them, he said. From that single command, one of history's greatest engineering miracles was born: the Mulberry Harbors. In secrecy, hundreds of engineers, shipwrights, and soldiers began designing a harbor that could be assembled in parts, towed across the sea, and anchored to the coast of Normandy, all in the middle of a war. It was a gamble of unimaginable scale. The plan called for 2 full-sized harbors, each capable of handling 7,000 tons of supplies per day. They would need floating piers, roadways, breakwaters, and massive concrete blocks called phoenix caissons, some weighing over 6,000 tons each. Nothing like it had ever been attempted. To hide their work from German spies, the British codenamed the project Mulberry. To the outside world, it was just another mysterious wartime construction effort. But inside shipyards and coastal assembly points from Scotland to southern England, the reality was staggering. By late 1943, over 45,000 men and women, dockworkers, steelworkers, engineers, soldiers, were laboring day and night. The factories never slept. Each section of harbor was a giant concrete box the size of an apartment building. When finished, these phoenixes would be towed out to sea by tugboats, floated to France, and sunk in precise positions to create breakwaters. And the floating roadways, the whales, were feats of engineering elegance. They were designed to rise and fall with the tides, strong enough to carry tanks, yet flexible enough to survive channel storms. Meanwhile, across the channel, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel inspected his Atlantic Wall. To him, it was impregnable. If the Allies land here, he boasted, we will throw them back into the sea within 24 hours. Rommel wasn't alone in that belief. The entire German high command dismissed any idea that the Allies could sustain an invasion without capturing a port. Their intelligence reports made no mention of artificial harbors. Even the most advanced minds in the Wehrmacht's engineering corps couldn't imagine such a concept being possible. The irony? The Allies had already begun building them. By the winter of 1943, the coastline of southern England was lined with half-finished concrete monoliths. Towns like Portsmouth, Chelsea, and Garleston became hubs of secret industry. On misty mornings, entire harbors could be seen rising from the sand, giant hollow boxes of reinforced concrete, waiting to be floated out. No one outside the project truly knew what was happening. Some locals joked that Britain was building houses for giants. But for those involved, the urgency was terrifying. D-Day was approaching, and the Mulberries had to be ready before June 1944, or the invasion would fail before it even began. It was a race against time, weather, and secrecy, and every hour mattered. By early May, the final caissons were complete. Each one bore a stenciled serial number and the faint smell of wet cement. Tugboats stood ready in the harbors, waiting for the order to tow them south toward the staging grounds. The engineers had done it, at least on paper. But would these floating harbors actually survive the English Channel, enemy fire, and the crushing tides of Normandy's beaches? No one knew. By the first week of June 1944, the English coastline pulsed with energy. The air smelled of diesel, sweat, and salt. Every harbor, from Portsmouth to Southampton, was packed with ships, landing craft, destroyers, transports, thousands of them. Hidden among them, disguised beneath tarps and camouflage nets, waited the greatest engineering secret of the war, the Mulberry components. The Phoenix caissons stood silent and hulking in the water, like ghosts of a drowned city waiting to rise again. Towed by convoys of tugboats, they would soon form the arteries through which an entire invasion would live or die. On June 5th, after days of weather delays, the final order came down from Eisenhower himself. Operation Overlord was a go. At dawn on June 6th, D-Day began. The sea was alive with the roar of engines, the thunder of guns, and the crashing of waves. Tens of thousands of men moved toward Normandy's beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, each a code name that would soon be written into history with blood. The first waves hit the shore under withering fire. At Omaha Beach, chaos reigned. The water turned dark with fuel, oil, and lives lost. Every few minutes, a landing craft exploded under artillery fire. For a moment, it seemed like the invasion might fail. The Allied planners had always known it would be brutal, but the scale of destruction was staggering. And still, amid that chaos, there was another worry burning at the back of every commander's mind. How would they keep this invasion supplied once the beaches were won? Behind the assault fleet, dozens of tugboats waited with their strange cargo. The Mulberries were ready to move. Each Phoenix caisson had been carefully filled with just enough air to stay afloat. They groaned against the waves, gray giants lumbering across the channel at a crawl. The men aboard could barely see ahead through the mist, only the occasional silhouette of another caisson drifting beside them. The journey was treacherous. One wrong move and a 6,000-ton block could capsize. The crews worked without rest, their orders simple: keep it moving, no matter what. As the beaches were secured, the engineers began the impossible task. Under sporadic shellfire and constant threat of Luftwaffe attacks, they started sinking the first Phoenixes into position. Explosive charges detonated deep beneath the waterline, flooding the hollow chambers and anchoring the structures to the seabed. Slowly, a line of gray monoliths began to rise from the surf, forming a breakwater where none had existed before. From the air, German reconnaissance pilots were stunned. What they saw below defied logic. An entire harbor materializing out of the ocean, piece by piece, like a city being summoned by some vast machine. The first pilots who radioed in their reports were laughed at. Berlin dismissed them as exaggerations. Impossible, one German intelligence officer said flatly. No army can build a port in the middle of the sea. But it was happening. The Mulberry Harbors, codenamed Mulberry A for Omaha and Mulberry B for Arromanches, were taking shape faster than anyone had dared hope. Over 200 Phoenix caissons, dozens of floating piers, and hundreds of steel pontoons were locked together by engineers who worked waist-deep in freezing surf, under constant enemy fire. Every bolt tightened, every anchor sunk, brought them one step closer to turning a beachhead into a lifeline. Within days, the transformation was astonishing. At Arromanches, ships began unloading directly onto floating roadways that led straight to the beach. Trucks, tanks, and supplies poured ashore in a continuous stream. The British harbor, Mulberry B, later nicknamed Port Winston, was functioning at nearly full capacity by June 17th, just 11 days after D-Day. At Omaha, the American engineers fought against worse luck. A massive storm brewed in the Atlantic, one of the fiercest ever recorded in the Channel. The winds howled at over 70 miles per hour. The waves smashed into the caissons with the force of a battering ram. For 3 days, the storm pounded the Normandy coast. When it cleared, the devastation was total. Mulberry A lay in ruins, shattered roadways, twisted pontoons, broken caissons scattered like bones across the beach. For a moment, it seemed the dream had died. The Americans had lost their harbor. But even in ruin, the Mulberries had already done their job. They had delivered thousands of tons of supplies that kept the invasion alive during those first critical days. And the British Mulberry at Arromanches survived. Against every odd, it stood firm through the storm, battered but unbroken. Engineers worked around the clock to repair it, welding and reinforcing with whatever scrap they could find. The harbor roared back to life, handling more than 7,000 tons of supplies per day, then 10,000, and eventually over 12,000, surpassing every prediction. By late July, Arromanches had become the beating heart of the Allied advance. Every jeep, every tank, every shell fired on the front lines of Normandy had passed over its floating bridges. Over 2.5 million men and 4 million tons of cargo would flow through those artificial harbors in less than a year. And still, the Germans could not comprehend what they were seeing. When captured officers were interrogated, many admitted they had assumed the Allies would fail without seizing Cherbourg or Le Havre. They had no idea an entire harbor could be manufactured in pieces and assembled under fire. One officer reportedly told his captors, "We thought you had magic." The reality was even more powerful than magic. It was industrial genius. The Mulberries proved that logistics, not just courage or firepower, wins wars. Churchill's floating piers had changed the fate of Europe. When the war ended, many of the Mulberry structures were left behind, silent monuments to the moment when human ingenuity conquered the impossible. Some of the old Phoenix caissons still stand off the coast of Normandy, weathered and half-submerged, covered in seaweed and barnacles. To the unknowing tourist, they look like ruins from another age. But for those who understand, they mark the spot where an army without a port built one from nothing and changed the course of history overnight. Even years later, when Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, was asked about the Atlantic Wall, he admitted something few in the Reich had ever said aloud. 17 million cubic meters of concrete, he said softly, and it was defeated by a floating pier. The Mulberry Harbors remain one of World War II's most remarkable achievements, an engineering miracle that turned imagination into victory. As the tide of war turned after D-Day, the Mulberry Harbors stood as a symbol of how innovation and determination could outmatch even the strongest fortifications. By mid-August 1944, the Allied advance had broken through the German defenses in Normandy, and supplies continued to pour in relentlessly through Port Winston at Arromanches. Each sunrise over the channel revealed a vast, living machine, ships unloading side by side, cranes swinging crates of ammunition, columns of tanks rumbling down steel causeways, and engineers guiding each operation with precision unmatched in wartime history. The harbor was never meant to last this long. Designed to function for just 90 days, it defied every expectation by operating for nearly 10 months. In that time, it weathered not only the ferocious channel storms, but also relentless wear and tear from constant use. Yet, through sheer willpower and mechanical brilliance, it endured. Every plank replaced, every girder tightened, every cable reinforced. It was an act of unending repair and adaptation, a living metaphor for Allied resilience itself. Even frontline soldiers understood what the harbor represented. One American infantryman, recalling his first sight of the floating docks, said, "It looked like something out of science fiction. Steel roads floating on the sea, leading to victory." For the exhausted troops pushing inland toward Cannes and beyond, the Mulberry Harbors were a lifeline, a promise that no matter how far they advanced, supplies would follow. Meanwhile, back in Germany, the disbelief turned to alarm. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Allies had built functional ports where none had existed. Speer's staff pored over aerial photographs showing the sprawling harbor systems, complete with fuel depots, cranes, and repair stations, all afloat. The Wehrmacht strategists realized too late that their entire coastal defense strategy, built around denying access to deep-water ports, had been outmaneuvered by imagination. Rommel's Atlantic Wall, once heralded as an impenetrable shield, was now exposed as obsolete. The very thing it sought to prevent, a massive amphibious invasion, had been achieved not by storming ports, but by building new ones. The Germans had fortified the wrong places. As Allied divisions pushed through Normandy and into France, the Mulberry system kept the flow of supplies running smoothly. The artificial harbor became so vital that it even took on the characteristics of a real port town. It had its own command posts, warehouses, and repair docks. British engineers slept in makeshift barracks built along the breakwaters, eating meals while waves lapped against their steel walls. It was a city that floated, functional, ugly, miraculous. By September 1944, as the Allies liberated Paris and pushed toward the Siegfried Line, the need for Mulberry slowly diminished. Real ports, like Cherbourg and Antwerp, were being restored to service. Yet even as they faded from the front lines, the legacy of the Mulberry Harbors was secured. Eisenhower himself would later write, "Without the port facilities created off Normandy, we could not have maintained our armies in France." Churchill, ever the visionary, took immense pride in the project. Years earlier, in a simple memo titled "Piers for Use on Beaches," he had sketched the idea that would change the course of the war. Now, as victory in Europe drew closer, his foresight was vindicated. What had begun as a daring thought in a memo became the backbone of an invasion that freed an entire continent. After the war, many of the Mulberry structures were dismantled or left to the sea. Some caissons were repurposed for civilian ports or coastal defenses, others simply abandoned. But a handful of them still remain today off the Normandy coast, silent gray sentinels watching over the beaches where thousands fought and died. Divers who explore them often describe an eerie feeling, as if they're swimming through the bones of a forgotten giant. Fish dart between the rusting beams, and seaweed sways gently where soldiers once walked. It is a haunting beauty, a reminder that victory does not always come from the most obvious weapons, but from the courage to imagine something new. Modern military engineers still study the Mulberry design. It stands as one of history's greatest examples of adaptive warfare, a fusion of creativity, logistics, and courage under fire. It taught armies that innovation could be as decisive as any bomb or bullet. When visitors stand on the cliffs of Arromanches today, looking out across the sea, they can still see the remnants of Port Winston stretching out across the horizon, their concrete shadows rising above the waves. Seagulls circle them now, and the sound of war has long faded. But for those who know the story, those remains whisper a single, enduring truth, that in the face of the impossible, humanity built the means to victory from nothing but vision, steel, and determination. In the months following the Normandy landings, the Mulberry Harbors became not just logistical hubs, but monuments to human willpower under fire. The constant rhythm of waves slapping against the steel pontoons mixed with the echo of engines, cranes, and the shouted orders of engineers working without rest. Every morning, convoys of ships arrived, Liberty ships, tankers, and troop transports, all guided into position by naval officers who had memorized every current, every wind shift, every tide pattern. At night, under dim red lights to avoid Luftwaffe detection, crews continued unloading ammunition, tanks, food, and medical supplies. The sea itself had become an extension of Allied industry. For the Germans, observing from a distance, disbelief turned to grim fascination. Reconnaissance planes captured grainy photographs of the enormous floating structures, complete ports appearing where none had existed days before. The German naval staff could scarcely believe what they saw. "They have built a harbor from nothing," one report read. "The sea itself works for them." In Berlin, these images circulated among officers who began to understand that Hitler's Atlantic Wall had failed not because of lack of effort, but because the Allies had simply outthought it. The idea that an army could bring its own ports across an ocean seemed absurd just a few years earlier. Even some Allied officers doubted the concept when Churchill first suggested it. Yet what they had dismissed as folly became the critical foundation of Operation Overlord's success. It wasn't just a feat of engineering, it was a philosophical triumph. The Allies no longer fought the war on German terms. Instead, they changed the rules entirely. By late summer 1944, Mulberry B, Port Winston at Arromanches, was handling an average of 7,000 tons of cargo per day. Tanks rolled directly from Liberty ships onto the floating roadways and then onto the beaches, moving inland to support the front lines. In less than 6 months, over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies passed through. These staggering numbers were not just statistics. They were the pulse of the Allied advance. Every bullet fired in France, every ration eaten, Every medical dressing applied could trace its journey back to those floating docks in the surf. Among the British engineers who maintained the port, exhaustion was constant, but pride ran deep. Many had never seen combat before, yet they faced the daily terror of air raids, high seas, and the constant threat of disaster. One Royal Engineer later recalled, "We weren't fighting with guns, but every bolt we tightened, every plank we replaced, was another shot fired against the enemy." When a brutal Channel storm struck in late June 1944, it seemed that nature itself had turned against the operation. Winds exceeding 60 knots battered the coastline for 3 straight days. Mulberry A, off Omaha Beach, was completely destroyed. Its caissons shattered, roadways twisted and sunk beneath the waves. But Mulberry B endured. Engineers fought through freezing spray and howling winds to keep the massive structures anchored. They used bulldozers, ropes, and sheer muscle to repair what could be saved. When the skies finally cleared, Port Winston still stood, battered but alive. That storm became a defining moment. It was proof that the harbor was not just a technological success. It was a testament to courage. Men who could have abandoned their posts instead stayed and fought against the elements, their determination matching that of the soldiers on the front lines. The Allied command realized then that Port Winston wasn't just a port. It was a miracle of human persistence. As the war moved inland, supplies from Mulberry Harbors kept the Allied juggernaut unstoppable. German defenses crumbled before an enemy that never ran out of food, fuel, or ammunition. Even captured Wehrmacht officers commented with disbelief at the endless convoys. One officer reportedly said, "Your factories fight harder than your soldiers." And he wasn't wrong. The Mulberry Harbors represented something far greater than mere steel and concrete. They were the embodiment of industrial democracy, of a collective effort that spanned oceans and nations. Every worker in a British shipyard, every welder in an American factory, every sailor guiding a tugboat through the storm had contributed to this invisible victory. When the final shots of war were fired and Europe was liberated, the Mulberry Harbors were already being dismantled, their purpose fulfilled. Yet even in their decay, they continued to serve. Some of their concrete caissons became sea barriers for coastal towns, protecting harbors from erosion. Others remain on the seafloor, monuments of rust and coral, slowly merging back into the ocean they once conquered. Decades later, historians and engineers would look back on the Mulberry Project as a turning point in military innovation, a moment when imagination defeated impossibility. The Allies didn't just invade a continent, they built the bridge to do it. Today, when the tide recedes at Arromanches, the outlines of those mighty structures still appear. Tourists walk among them, unaware that beneath their feet lies one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. The waves whisper against the old steel, carrying faint echoes of hammers, engines, and distant voices shouting over the roar of the sea. It was here, between water and sky, that victory began, not with a weapon, but with an idea. As the months turned into a year after D-Day, the Mulberry Harbor at Arromanches, Port Winston, continued to function far beyond its intended lifespan. Designed to last only 90 days, it endured for 10 long months, standing as a testament to Allied resilience. Even as new ports like Cherbourg and Antwerp came under Allied control, the Mulberry remained operational, a symbol of British craftsmanship and Allied cooperation. The tides still rose and fell around the concrete Phoenix caissons, the same tides that had once carried a miracle across the Channel. By spring 1945, as Allied tanks thundered across the Rhine and German resistance collapsed, the engineers who had built the Mulberries began dismantling what was left of them. Some wept quietly as they cut the final mooring lines. Others stood silently, watching the tide reclaim their creation. What they had built had changed the course of the war, and perhaps the course of history. For these men, it wasn't just machinery or logistics. It was the physical embodiment of courage, intellect, and cooperation in the face of overwhelming odds. When the last caisson was towed away, Winston Churchill sent a private note of gratitude to the teams involved, writing, "The success of Overlord was built upon the courage of men and the genius of those who made the sea our servant." Those words would echo for generations, capturing the spirit of what the Mulberry Harbors had accomplished. They had turned the impossible into reality. In post-war Germany, Captured officers studying Allied logistics expressed astonishment at what they learned. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later admitted that all the concrete, steel, and manpower Germany had poured into the Atlantic Wall, 17 million cubic meters of it, had been rendered useless by the Allies' portable ports. He called the Mulberry Harbors a work of stunning simplicity and effectiveness, a creation that not only neutralized years of German labor, but exposed the weakness of their entire defensive philosophy. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the shipyards and factories that had built the harbors returned to peace production, their workers proud but exhausted. Many had never known the full importance of what they were constructing. Only later did they realize that their efforts had enabled the liberation of Europe. A riveter from the Thornycroft Yard in Southampton once said, "We thought we were just building blocks of concrete. Turns out, we built freedom itself." Today, at low tide on the beaches of Normandy, you can still see the skeletal remains of Mulberry B, the concrete giants half buried in sand, dark with seaweed, silent witnesses to history. Tourists and veterans' families walk among them, taking photos, unaware that beneath their feet lie the bones of one of humanity's greatest logistical triumphs. The sea laps gently against their sides, as if paying homage to the men who dared to command it. In every ripple of that water is the memory of the chaos of 1944, the roar of ships, the grind of machinery, the thunder of war. And in that sound lies the quiet victory of ingenuity. The moment humankind learned that no wall, no storm, no empire could stand against the power of collective innovation. The story of the Mulberry Harbors isn't just about steel and strategy, it's about vision. About how, in the darkest days of war, ordinary men and women looked across the sea and decided to build a bridge to freedom. And when the first Allied convoys rolled through those floating docks, the world witnessed something extraordinary. The triumph of imagination over fear, of cooperation over chaos, and of courage over conquest. Because in the end, the Allies didn't just invade Normandy. They built the road to victory, piece by piece, wave by wave, bolt by bolt, until the impossible became inevitable. As the war neared its end, the echoes of the Mulberry Harbors' success continued to resonate through every Allied camp, command post, and liberated town. The men who had once doubted whether the sea could be tamed now looked upon the remains of those floating ports with reverence. They understood that what had happened off the coast of Normandy was not just a feat of engineering. It was a triumph of human determination. By the spring of 1945, Allied forces had driven deep into Germany. Supplies that once came ashore through the Mulberry Harbors had fueled an unstoppable advance. Trucks, tanks, fuel drums, and food for millions of soldiers. Every shell fired, every tank that rolled forward, every town liberated had, in some way, passed over those steel and concrete bridges that stretched from sea to shore. The miracle of logistics had become the backbone of victory. When victory was finally declared in May 1945, the soldiers who had landed on those beaches returned to find fragments of the Mulberry still standing. The massive concrete phoenix caissons, some cracked and scarred from storms and explosions, remained silent along the Normandy coast. They had done their duty and endured both the fury of war and the wrath of nature. For many veterans, those decaying shapes became sacred monuments, not of destruction, but of creation. In Britain, the engineers, welders, and laborers who had built the harbors returned to ordinary lives. They melted back into civilian society, their extraordinary work fading quietly into history. Many never received medals or headlines. Yet, in their hands, they had held the fate of nations. They had proved that imagination and cooperation could achieve what armies alone could not. Winston Churchill, in his post-war memoirs, would later write that the success of Operation Overlord depended on the power to land and sustain great armies upon hostile shores. And that power came, quite literally, from the harbors that had been dreamed into existence. Historians would go on to call the Mulberry Project one of the greatest engineering triumphs in human history, a masterpiece of necessity and courage. Even the Germans, after the war, admitted their astonishment. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, confessed that the Mulberry concept had outmatched anything they could have imagined. "We were prepared for guns and tanks," he wrote, but not for ingenuity that could turn the sea itself into an ally. Decades later, the remains of Mulberry B, Port Winston, still stand at Arromanches. At low tide, the sea retreats to reveal the dark, barnacle-covered bones of that once great structure. Children play among them, unaware of the enormity of what those ruins represent. Veterans, now few and frail, have stood before those remains and wept quietly, remembering the storm, the smoke, the thunder of war, and the harbor that saved a continent. The waves whisper against the concrete, carrying stories that time can never erase. They tell of nights filled with fire and fear, of men who worked without rest to keep the bridges intact, of ships arriving by the thousands, bringing with them hope for a free Europe. The Mulberry Harbors were never meant to last forever. Yet, long after the guns fell silent, their legacy endures. They remind us that victory in war is not only won by those who fight, but also by those who build, by those who dare to dream beyond the horizon. And so, as the sun sets over Normandy, the sea glows gold around the old caissons, as if honoring them one final time. The tides rise and fall, the wind hums softly through the relics, and the world moves on, free, because of what was once built there. From imagination to reality, from steel to victory, the Mulberry Harbors proved one timeless truth: that even in humanity's darkest hour, the power to create can still conquer the will to destroy.